Earl Morris was vacationing in California, he learned his wife had been reported missing from their home in Arizona.
What? Mom's missing? What happened?
The search for Ruby Morris involved dozens of police investigators, forensic scientists, DNA testing, and even the Coast Guard.
I'm heading home.
The results of that investigation surprised everyone, especially Earl Morris. Ruby and Earl Morris were partners in both business and in marriage. They had been married for over 20 years and were the parents of 3 grown children. The Morrises were both accountants and operated their own accounting and tax preparation firm.
They had had it for years and years, and they built it up, together from scratch, and it was doing very well.
Their business made them millionaires, and they raised their 3 children in this luxurious mountain home just outside of Phoenix. On June 4th, 1989, Earl Morris headed to California to see his oldest daughter, Donna Kay, perform in a concert. She was a country singer with a promising career. Ruby decided not to join her husband on that trip, planning instead to go shopping with her other daughter, Cindy, for some furniture for her new home. But Ruby didn't show up on Sunday morning at Cindy's home for the planned shopping trip. So Cindy drove out to her parents' home.
That's totally unlike her mom. Her mother kept every, date that she ever had with her, and unless she called her and canceled, and she didn't do this.
Ruby Morris wasn't home. The burglar alarm was turned off. Ruby's pocketbook was missing, but her car was still there, although it wasn't parked in its usual spot. Ruby Morris was a neat, meticulous person, and her daughter noticed right away that things were out of place. A faucet was dripping in the bathtub. Dirty clothes were piled high inside the washing machine and hadn't been washed. A carpet shampoo cleaner was left out, but the most troubling discovery was that a .22 caliber pistol usually kept in a closet was missing. Cindy Morris immediately called the police.
And that's really all I expected it to be, was another missing persons case that this person would be found in a couple of hours.
When Earl Morris heard the news of his wife's disappearance, he told family members that he would head straight home from California. If Cindy Morris was right, and something happened to her mother, investigators hoped to find some clues to her whereabouts inside the Morris home. It took Earl Morris longer than anticipated to drive home from California, but when he arrived, the police were anxious to speak with him.
So have you ever had any fights?
Earl Morris told police that their relationship was basically a good one with occasional arguments, but nothing out of the ordinary.
She ever done anything at all like this before? Left and just...
Yeah, she's done it before, but she usually calls, or gets mad or something.
Morris also confirmed that the .22 caliber pistol the couple owned was not in the closet where he last saw it.
We were going in several different directions with this, that the possibility of that she was missing, possibility of a suicide, possibility of a homicide.
The car broke down.
Earl Morris told police that his car broke down on the drive home from California and that he rented a car to complete the trip. But Detective Lugenbuehl noticed something suspicious when he looked inside the trunk of the rental car. Attached to Earl's suitcase was an airline luggage tag for a recent flight from San Diego to Phoenix. A search of the passenger list from that flight did not include the name of Earl Morris, although there was a G. Norris listed. Police put together a group of photographs, including one of Earl Morris, and showed it to the airline crew members to see if anyone recalled seeing Earl on that flight. One of the flight attendants remembered him distinctly because of the poor quality of his toupee. Faced with this inconsistency, detectives decided to search the Morris home further to see if there was any evidence of foul play which might have been overlooked during their first visit.
So what we did is we called in our ID techs to give us a hand, and we asked them to do luminol.
When luminol is sprayed onto an area, a black light is used. The luminol will actually glow when it comes into contact with the blood enzymes. Forensic detectives began their search in the master bedroom, spraying luminol on the headboard of the bed. An area instantly turned blue. It was a very fine mist pattern, one they immediately recognized.
To me, upon looking at it, you could determine, because of the distribution, the shape, and the size of the droplets, that it was high velocity from gunshot.
Only a bullet produces a fine mist of blood similar to that found on the headboard. A beating or stabbing produces a much different blood spatter pattern. On the surface of the mattress, they found tiny blood stains, and they also found blood inside the mattress itself. Next, investigators sprayed luminol in the bathroom.
The entire shower stall lit up, basically, with the luminol.
Luminol tests also revealed blood on the cement patio outside the master bedroom, as well as on the master bedroom carpet.
We noticed that the whole bedroom floor, which was carpeted, started to glow.
And we knew that from what we were seeing that we did have a violent crime scene, maybe not a death, but somebody had suffered some pretty good injuries at that point.
But detectives had no idea to whom the blood belonged. To find out, scientists conducted a DNA test on the blood stain. The results of that test shocked everyone. A deep, dark family secret would soon be revealed. Police suspected that the blood stain found in the Morris's bedroom belonged to Ruby Morris, but there was no blood from the body to match the blood in the bedroom. But science can often identify a blood stain by using DNA testing. By analyzing the DNA from children, for example, scientists can tell whether the blood stain would have come from a parent.
In the case of children, 50% of the DNA from each child will come from one parent, and the other 50% will come from the other parent. So this obligated inheritance of DNA from the mother to children is one of the important factors that we are looking for in conducting this analysis.
Since children get half of their DNA from their mother and the other half from their father, a DNA profile of the children and from one of the parents can give scientists enough genetic information to identify the DNA profile of the other parent, even without a blood sample. If the DNA profile of the missing parent matches the DNA profile of the blood stain, scientists will then analyze the DNA from a missing person's siblings to confirm their findings. When scientists compared Cindy Morris's DNA to the DNA from the blood stain, they found one matching band. They also found one matching band when comparing the DNA profile of Ruby's brother to the blood stain.
It's highly probable that those bloodstains came from Ruby Morris.
But scientists noticed something peculiar. When they compared Earl Morris's DNA to the DNA profile of his daughter, Cindy, there were no matching bands. Earl Morris was not Cindy's biological father. When they compared Earl Morris's DNA to his oldest child, Randy, they discovered the same thing. Earl was not Randy's biological father either. Randy's DNA matched that of his grandfather, his mother's father. When law enforcement authorities in Tennessee learned of these DNA results, Ruby's father was charged with incest. According to the DNA tests, Ruby's father had sex with her when she was just 15 years old.
Well, we had a surprise. And we felt that perhaps the family would be surprised by it, and that Earl Morris himself was surprised by it.
The Morris children had another family secret to reveal. They admitted that their mother had been depressed recently since she learned her husband Earl was having an affair with her sister, Peggy. In fact, Ruby and her daughter, Cindy, once caught the two together at the Phoenix airport when Peggy secretly flew to Phoenix to meet with Earl. Ruby confronted Earl about the affair, but he reportedly refused to end it.
Also looking at Peggy, the sister. She had motive and opportunity to be involved in this too. She lived in Louisiana at the time, but we discovered that she had a planned vacation going to San Diego that weekend. We discovered phone calls that Earl had made to her.
Peggy admitted to police that she had planned to meet Earl in San Diego shortly after Ruby disappeared, but missed her flight. But police knew Earl had been in San Diego, not only because of the baggage claim tag on his suitcase, but they also found his car in the airport parking lot. The car appeared to be clean. But when luminol was applied to the inside of the vehicle, the floor of the passenger side revealed a huge blood stain. So much blood that the individual it came from would almost certainly be dead. A DNA analysis of the blood in the car revealed that it matched the blood stain found in the Morris' bedroom, which scientists concluded belonged to Ruby.
We didn't know where the body was. We didn't know if he would transport the body to San Diego. Why would he transport it down there? We had no real clue.
The clue was here in a San Diego marina. The Morrises owned a boat which was stored there. Marina employees told police that Earl Morris was at the marina on June 5th and had taken the boat for a ride. When police went to search the boat, they discovered it was missing. The Coast Guard was asked to help locate the missing boat, and they told police about a mysterious fire on a boat about the same size, which burned and sank 13 miles offshore from the San Diego marina. This is actual footage of the fire taken by a television news crew.
There were no survivors, no people anywhere in sight. The first thing that was unusual was the way it burned. It burned pretty much from the center out, and normally the fire's starting either in the engine room or in the fuel compartment. And it just looked very suspect right from the beginning. So the things that stood out were the fact that there was like a lantern right in the middle of the boat, right on top of the melted fiberglass, which looked like somebody had thrown it there and possibly started a fire.
Records indicated that Earl Morris rented a small boat on the morning of June 5th and returned it around 12 noon, about the same time the Coast Guard discovered the burning boat. It was beginning to appear that the body of Ruby Morris was on that burning boat which sank to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. But prosecutors believed that they still had enough evidence to prove Ruby Morris had been murdered.
You start building all of those together, and then what you have is Ruby Morris's blood, Ruby Morris's bed, Ruby Morris with a high-velocity gunshot wound that killed her in her bed at her home. Who was there? Earl Morris.
Earl Morris was charged with the murder of his wife, Ruby, but the case was far from over. Investigators were in for another big surprise. Earl Morris's defense would be a challenge for forensic science. In 1991, Earl Morris went on trial for the murder of his wife. The prosecution first had to convince the jury that a murder had taken place since there was no body.
We had to build the case from scratch. We had to prove a corpus delicti, that in fact a murder had occurred, without the physical evidence for someone to look at.
According to the prosecution, Earl Morris entered the master bedroom early on Saturday morning, June 4th. He dragged her body into an adjacent bathroom, removed her clothing, and put her into the bathtub to remove the blood. He then dressed her body in a jogging suit, covered her head wound with a baseball cap, and carried the body to the garage. Since his car didn't have a trunk, He had no choice but to place the body into the passenger side of the front seat. Earl then cleaned all of the blood from inside the house, from the headboard, the bathtub, the carpets, all later revealed by the luminol. Earl began his journey to San Diego, driving nearly 400 miles with his wife's body in the seat next to him. Blood continued to drip from the head wound, falling to the floor beneath the seat, later discovered by the luminol test. Earl stopped once for gas, and no one noticed that his passenger was dead. When Morris arrived in San Diego, he towed his boat to the launch. And in broad daylight, placed Ruby's body on the boat along with some of the bloody sheets and the murder weapon. He also took along a lantern and some gasoline. After renting a smaller boat, he set off to sea, towing the rented boat behind. 13 miles offshore in the Pacific Ocean, Earl Morris prepared the boat for destruction, hoping to bury not only his wife's body, but all of the remaining evidence of his involvement. After dousing the boat with gasoline, he stepped into the rental boat, lit the lantern, and threw it onto the deck. He left before being spotted by the Coast Guard. Sometime after Morris left the scene, a news crew captured these pictures while the boat was still on fire, minutes before it sank. Neither Ruby Morris nor the boat was ever recovered. During the trial, Earl Morris delivered a surprising defense. He admitted that his wife was dead and that her body was indeed on the boat that burned and sank. Morris also admitted to setting the fire and sinking the boat. But Earl Morris insisted he did not kill his wife. He said she committed suicide because of guilt and depression, guilt over the fact that her husband wasn't the father of 2 of their children, and depression about Earl's affair with her sister Peggy.
My first thoughts were that I would be blamed for Ruby committing suicide.
After you had those thoughts, did you make any decisions?
Yes, I did.
What decisions did you make?
To hide the fact with what she'd done.
Up until that point in time, we had circumstantial evidence that she was dead. No one to say, I saw Ruby Morris's body. No one to say, I saw Ruby Morris injured. No one to say, I saw the shooting, I heard the shooting.
Earl Morris testified that he discovered his wife with a gunshot wound in her left temple and that she used the couple's .22 caliber pistol. He said he found her body after the suicide and feared he would be blamed. So he disposed of the body by sinking the boat. But the forensic evidence proved otherwise. The blood spatter evidence told forensic detectives that Ruby could not have committed suicide. Earl said the gunshot wound was in the left side of her head, but Ruby was right-handed. It would have been impossible for a right-handed individual to shoot herself in the left temple using her right hand, especially with the long-barrel .22 caliber pistol the Morrises owned. But the strongest argument came from the blood spatter evidence on the headboard. The blood patterns revealed 2 layers of spatter, one on top of the other. This told forensic experts that there were 2 shots.
One shot could not have caused the distribution of 2 separate patterns. There were actually 2 separate patterns going at 2 different angles that are not, you cannot create that in one shot.
And a person committing suicide does not shoot twice to the head. The jury saw Earl Morris's last-minute claim of suicide as just one more lie. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life.
He dropped traces of Ruby Morris, and that was Ruby Morris on the floor, that was Ruby Morris in the El Camino, that was Ruby Morris in the bed that was saying, this is what happened. That was our read on it. So Ruby Morris was actually telling us what happened to her.
No body, no gun, no confession. The science gave us Ruby Morris and gave us the corpus delicti. If it had not been for the blood in the car and the DNA testing, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today. Earl Morris would be a free man.
Sit up a little
As Peggy Carr lay ill in a hospital intensive care unit, doctors were baffled.
Take a deep breath for me now.
Lab tests were all negative, but one of the doctors noticed a tiny clue. Her hair was falling out. It was a symptom of a very rare condition, one the doctor had never seen before. And if he was right, there was no known cure. Peggy Carr was a 41-year-old restaurant worker who had been married to her second husband, Pye, for the last 6 months. Peggy worked as a waitress at a drive-in restaurant and had 3 children from a previous marriage. Pye had 2 children and worked at a phosphate mine.
They seemed to be happy. My mom loved him more than anything. You know, he was just the light of her life. You know, he was it.
But soon after their marriage, Peggy began to question the long hours Pye was working at the mine.
He worked all the time. There were some questions about if he was really at work or if he was out.
One night when Pye said he was working late, Peggy drove out to the mine. In the parking lot, she saw only 2 cars. One was Pye's. The other belonged to one of his former girlfriends.
My mom went out to where he worked, and we found him with another woman.
When I guess she found out that he was cheating, things started, going downhill.
When Peggy learned of the affair, she took her children to a nearby motel and left her husband a note.
Dear Pye, I'm going to give you some time to think about us. I can't live like we have been. I can't imagine living without you, but I can if you don't want me. I love you with all my heart. Peggy.
After a brief separation, the couple resolved their differences and Peggy and her children moved back home. On the day she returned, Pye left for a previously scheduled hunting trip. While he was away, Peggy became ill, complaining of an upset stomach and an intense burning sensation. When Pye returned home, he told the children he thought it was only a virus.
She was sick. She was very sick. She was laying in bed and she couldn't move. She kept complaining of her hands and her feet. She said she couldn't open her eyes. She was nauseated.
By the time Peggy was taken to the hospital, doctors noticed some weakness in both sides of her face. But when lab tests were negative and they couldn't diagnose her problem, Peggy was released.
The next day I went up to check on her and she was even worse. And I told Pye, I said, we need to take her to the hospital again because she's not getting any better. Well, he went to work.
The children drove her to the hospital once again. This time, one of the physicians who examined her noticed a tiny clue.
I noticed that her hair, simply raising her up off the pillow to listen to her back, quite a bit of her hair was left on the pillow.
Dr. Robert Van Hook and his colleagues thought it might be a poison, a very rare one, which doesn't show up in normal lab tests. A special test confirmed his suspicion. It was thallium poisoning. Thallium is a highly toxic metal, widely used as a pesticide before it was banned in the United States in 1972. Once inside the body, thallium attacks nerve endings and muscles, causing them to atrophy and die. In severe cases, it can cause delirium, paralysis, coma, even death. Tests reveal that Peggy had 50 times the maximum human exposure in her system, and there is no known cure or antidote. Within days, Peggy's stepson Travis and son Dwayne were hospitalized as well. They too had thallium poisoning.
Where it was like somebody taking 1,000 needles, putting your feet in them and just pressing all at once. And real painful. Something that you just couldn't, let go.
How did Peggy Carr and the two boys ingest such large amounts of thallium? Was it accidental, or was someone trying to kill them? Since there is no cure or antidote for thallium poisoning, Peggy Carr's condition grew progressively worse. After losing all of her hair, she slipped into a coma. Health officials frantically searched for the source of the thallium. The orange grove next to the Carr's home was tested to determine whether thallium had been sprayed on the orange trees. And the drinking water well in the area was also tested, but thallium wasn't found. Next, health officials gathered air and dust samples from inside the Carr's home and took more than 400 household items for laboratory analysis. Friends told police that the family received an anonymous threatening letter just a few months earlier. It was addressed to Pye Carr, misspelling Pye's name.
You and all your so-called family have 2 weeks to move out of Florida forever, or else you all die. This is no joke.
Police were suspicious of Pye Carr, not only because he failed to mention the threatening letter, but also because of his extramarital affair, the fact that he was away when Peggy first got sick, and his hesitation in taking Peggy to the hospital.
We dug very deeply at that point into Pye Carr's background, anything that would show motivation on his part to poison his wife.
We thought, Pye had something to do with it, because the way he was acting so strange, he was always so secretive. It's like he always had something to hide.
All of the remaining family members were asked to undergo thallium testing as well, just as a precaution. And the results were surprising. Peggy's daughter Sissy and her child Casey both had traces of thallium in their systems. And so did Pye. The only family member found not to have thallium in her system was Pye's daughter Tammy. When the laboratory analyzed the items from the Carr's home, they found the source of the thallium in some empty soda bottles. Detectives returned to the Carr home and found 3 full bottles from the same carton. The FBI found no fingerprints on the full bottles recovered from the Carr's home. But under a scanning electron microscope, magnified 100 times, the FBI discovered tiny scratch marks on the caps, an indication that they had been meticulously removed and replaced. Using a process called flame atomic absorption spectroscopy, the soda produced a distinctive greenish color to the flame, a positive indication that thallium was present. Tests revealed that each of the 3 bottles contained more than a gram of thallium, enough to kill an adult. Thallium causes drinks to overflow, alters the color, and produces a noticeable sediment on the bottom. But the mixture found in the soda avoided these problems, and was a mixture which will not be revealed in this program. The FBI knew this was not the work of an amateur. The sophisticated knowledge of chemistry, the professional removal and reattachment of the bottle caps told the FBI that the killer was very smart, very organized, and would be very difficult to catch. When Peggy Carr slipped into a coma, her doctors had little, if any, hope for her recovery. Her son and stepson were both in serious condition, but expected to recover. Pye's daughter Tammy was the only family member without thallium in her system. She told police she didn't drink the soda because she consumed only diet drinks. And when thallium was found in Pye's system, he was no longer considered a suspect. With no other leads, the FBI was asked to provide a psychological profile of the poisoner. The profiling unit believed that the poisoner was highly intelligent, a white male in his mid-30s who resolves conflict without direct confrontation. He liked to read about murder, watch violent movies, and would then fantasize about committing murder.
It's more of a passive type of person, and it's more of a cowardly type of crime. You don't have to look the intended victim in the eye. It's very similar to a bomber, very similar type of personality.
The FBI suggested police question the neighbors because whoever poisoned the family knew their comings and goings and planted the soda without being seen. The Carr's only neighbor was Dr. Diana Carr, no relation to Peggy Carr, and her husband, George Trepal. Diana Carr had a master's degree in chemistry and graduated from medical school as an orthopedic surgeon. Her husband, George, was a freelance writer for a computer magazine. Both were highly intelligent and members of Mensa, an organization for individuals with IQs in the top 2% of the population. Police learned that Diana Carr had a fight with Peggy just a week before she was poisoned.
She was cussing, ranting and raving about my two brothers having music on in the front yard, telling them to turn it down.
My mom had enough of this lady, yelling at her, screaming at her, cussing at her, so she turned around and walked off, said, "I'm done talking with you."
She says, this ain't over yet. This ain't over yet.
A background check revealed that Trepal had been arrested in North Carolina in the mid-70s for running one of the largest methamphetamine labs in the eastern United States. The drug agent who arrested Trepal called him the smartest chemist he had ever known. On March 3rd, 1989, 4 months after she was poisoned, Peggy Carr died. It was now a murder investigation. The Sheriff's Department assigned Special Agent Susan Gorick to the case. She was asked to go undercover to infiltrate the Mensa group to which George Trepal and Diana Carr belonged, an experience she vividly described in her best-selling book, Poison Mind. Under an assumed name and identity, Susan Gorick attended a Mensa murder mystery weekend which George and his wife Diana were hosting.
Before I went to the weekend, I spoke with the people up at the FBI Behavioral Science Unit to see if I could get some tips on the type of person or type of personality that I should develop if I was to meet George Trepal.
When Gorick arrived for the weekend, she received a copy of the murder scenarios George Trepal wrote for the participants. One was a murder by poisoning.
Few voodooists believe that they can be killed by psychic means, but no one doubts that he can be poisoned.
Susan Gorick accomplished her mission that weekend when George Trepal befriended her.
He's very intelligent, maybe a little eccentric. A lot of people would call him odd, but because I spent so much time with him, I got to know him, and I did see a good side of him. I did see a nice personality, but I also saw a very evil side.
Oh yeah, somebody got poisoned next door.
In her undercover role, always under surveillance, Gorick met with Trepal on numerous occasions, hoping to gather evidence of his involvement in the poisonings. Their relationship led to an important break. A year after Peggy Carr's death, George and his wife Diana moved. They rented their old home to George's new friend, Susan Gorick. She moved in before all of the couple's belongings had been removed. And when she did, homicide detectives moved in with her. They searched the house and the shed Trepal used as a workshop.
We sent everything from the workshop garage to the FBI laboratory for them to examine.
Inside one of the bottles, the FBI discovered thallium, similar to the type found in the soda bottles in the Carr home.
We had a lot of circumstantial evidence, but this was the only piece of real evidence that you could actually put your hands on.
The police then searched Trepal's new home and discovered a notebook George captioned "General Poisoning Guides." Inside were excerpts from books used by homicide detectives. One was Death by Poison. Another listed details of the uses and effects of thallium. George Trepal was arrested for the murder of Peggy Carr and the attempted murder of the entire Carr family. Police believe that George Trepal grew annoyed with his neighbors, especially the children. When the threatening letter failed to scare the family away, Trepal took a more direct approach. He purchased some soda and carefully removed all of the bottle caps with special tools. His chemical knowledge led him to choose a poison which had no cure or antidote, one that couldn't be detected by conventional medical tests. It was hauntingly similar to the plot he would later write for the Murder Mystery Weekend.
When a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. Most items on a doorstep are just a neighbor's way of saying, "I don't like you. Move or else."
The Carr family remembers drinking the soda at a family dinner when they had fried chicken. Pye Carr was drinking bourbon and added a splash of soda from one of the bottles. Pye's daughter, Tammy, was drinking diet soda and was the only family member who wasn't poisoned.
Yeah, Mom, if I wanted to get a job, can I get a job and save up for...
Peggy most likely ingested more soda than the others because she had the highest thallium levels. After she was hospitalized, her condition deteriorated. She slipped into a coma and died 4 months later.
Why not?
The two boys were also hospitalized, but recovered.
I would say that this whole case is science. This case was about being able to find the thallium in the washings of the empty bottles. When Coca-Cola did the experiments, that proof was extremely compelling. The science at the FBI lab, if you pick up those bottle caps, you can't possibly, I don't think with a magnifying glass, can find those tool marks. And yet, they're so obvious in the blown up pictures that the FBI did. Another thing very important about the science was George's knowledge of the science and the amount of literature we found in his house that backed it up.
When Trepal went on trial in 1991, the case against him was largely circumstantial. Trepal's criminal history as head chemist for an illegal methamphetamine lab. The fact that he used similar phraseology in an interview with the police that was used in the threatening letter. His authorship of the murder mystery storyline dealing with both a poisoning and a threatening letter. The bottle with thallium found in his work shed, and the books with information on the use of thallium found in his home.
The whole case is circumstantial. I mean, that was my whole closing argument. And the way that we approached it because of that was to exclude every other person on the face of the earth.
The defense argued there was no proof that Trepal purchased the soda. His fingerprints were not found on the soda bottles or on the vial of thallium. His lawyer also suggested that there was reasonable doubt. All of the evidence could also point to Trepal's wife, Diana, who had a master's degree in chemistry. It took the jury just 6 hours to reach a verdict. George Tree Powell was found guilty of all charges, and he was sentenced to death.
I couldn't believe it. I honestly didn't believe it, because the man that I knew, was the man I mowed his driveway because it was 2 foot off of our property line. I mowed his driveway. He always waved at me. Sure, he was weird. He was a nerd. I heard he was a chemical freak or whatever, but he didn't seem capable of murder, not in my eyes,
He did the most horrible act that I've ever seen as a homicide investigator. A heinous act. He killed one person, put her through torture before her death.
She was really, truly my best friend. She was my maid of honor at my wedding. She was the only one I had for a long time. My dad wasn't always there, and she always was. I miss her a lot.
The rain had been falling for 3 days straight when the call came in, a thin, crackling voice on a recorded line, the kind of call detectives remember for the rest of their lives, the kind that turns coffee cold in your hands because it didn't begin with a name or a demand or even an apology. It began with a sentence that cut through 20 years of silence like a blade. I was there the night she disappeared, and I can't carry it anymore. The clock on the wall read 2:17 a.m., red digits glowing in the dark, the building half asleep, Oregon wrapped in wet asphalt and mist, and in that moment the past stopped being past, a cold case file shuddering awake, dust lifting from paper that had not been touched since the Clinton administration, since flannel shirts and payphones and a town that believed bad things happened somewhere else. Back then it was a Wednesday, the kind of ordinary day that never makes headlines until it does, the kind of day parents remember forever because it was the last time they saw their child alive, and the air that morning had smelled like pine and damp earth, the smell that still clings to the memory like it refuses to let go. The town sat between forest and highway, a place you could miss if you blinked, a place with one blinking traffic light and a diner that closed at 8, where people waved even if they didn't know your name, where doors were locked but not out of fear, more out of habit, and when she vanished it felt like the ground itself had shifted, like the trees leaned in closer to listen. She was 22, home for the summer, working shifts at a grocery store, saving money, making plans that never made it past a spiral notebook on her desk, plans for travel, for escape, for something bigger than a town that felt too small once you learned how big the world could be. That night she told her mother she'd be back by 10, told her father she loved him, grabbed her jacket even though it wasn't that cold, and walked out into a street lit by orange sodium lamps, her footsteps swallowed by the sound of rain starting up again. By midnight, she hadn't come home. By 1 the worry had settled in, heavy and undeniable. By dawn the phone calls had begun, friends first, then hospitals, then police, and by noon her face was being photocopied and taped to windows, a smile frozen in cheap ink, the word missing printed underneath, like a challenge. Officers walked the route she was known to take, boots splashing through puddles, flashlights catching nothing but wet leaves and cigarette butts. No sign of a struggle, no abandoned purse, no jacket, no blood, nothing that made sense, and that absence was the first cruelty of the case, the way it gave nothing back. The highway roared nearby, trucks passing through without slowing down, and for the first time the town felt exposed, like it sat too close to a road that could carry anyone away. Tips came in fast at first, voices shaking with certainty, everyone convinced they'd seen something, a car idling too long, a stranger at the bar, a scream that might have been a fox, detectives scribbling notes, pinning timelines, chasing leads that dissolved in the rain, and the days turned into weeks, weeks into months, the search parties thinning as hope quietly bled out. Her parents kept the porch light on, night after night, an unspoken signal, a ritual that bordered on superstition, because turning it off felt like surrender, and every time a car slowed on the street their hearts leapt, only to sink again as the taillights disappeared into the dark. The investigation slowed, not because it didn't matter, but because there was nothing left to grab onto, no body, no crime scene, No suspect who stayed suspicious long enough to stick, and the file grew thick with paper and thin with answers. Detectives rotated out, new faces flipping through old reports, asking the same questions, hearing the same silences. The case labeled cold not because anyone stopped caring, but because time had done what it always does, numb the edges, push the pain into a place people could function around. But the town never forgot, not really, and neither did the family. Birthdays passing with an empty chair, holidays celebrated with a photograph on the mantel, the absence becoming its own presence, heavy and permanent. Years later, technology changed, DNA databases grew. Old evidence was re-examined, but there was little to test, little to compare, and the forest kept its secrets, roots breaking down anything they touched, rain washing away footprints that were never documented, and the case stayed frozen in amber, referenced in hushed tones, brought up whenever another young woman went missing somewhere else. A reminder that sometimes people simply vanish. Then the call came, decades later, from a man whose name didn't ring bells at first, a man older now, voice rough with age and something else, something that sounded like fear or relief or both. And when detectives pulled his old address, they realized he'd lived 2 blocks from her, close enough to hear sirens, close enough to watch search parties pass by, close enough to know exactly when the town went to sleep again. They brought him in quietly, no cameras, no press, just a small interview room and a recorder clicking on. And at first he talked about the weather, about how it had been raining that week too, how Oregon rain has a way of getting into your bones. And then he stopped dancing around it and said her name, said it like it hurt his mouth, said he'd seen her that night, said he'd offered a ride, said she'd hesitated, said she'd gotten in anyway. And in that moment the case shifted, the kind of shift you can feel in your chest, because confession is a dangerous word. It promises clarity, but often delivers something far messier. He spoke in fragments, memory colliding with imagination, truth tangled with years of telling himself a story he could live with, and detectives leaned in, letting the silence do the work, knowing that once someone starts talking like this, they rarely stop on their own. Outside, the rain had started again, tapping against the windows like it was trying to listen, and in that small room the past began to breathe, every sentence pulling the town back to that night, to the streetlights, to the sound of footsteps fading, and for the first time in decades the mystery cracked open, not solved, not yet, but open enough to remind everyone that cold cases are only cold until someone decides they can't stay quiet anymore. He said he had been driving aimlessly, that word aimless hanging in the air like an excuse that had aged poorly, said he saw her walking alone, shoulders hunched against the drizzle, backpack tight against her spine, and something about that image lodged itself in his mind. A young woman on a familiar street that suddenly felt unfamiliar, and he slowed the car, rolled down the window, asked if she wanted a ride. Casual, harmless, the kind of offer that happens 1,000 times without consequence. Except this time she looked at him longer than usual, rain streaking across the windshield, streetlight flickering, a pause that now felt enormous in hindsight. He told detectives she smiled, said she was almost home, said she hesitated because every warning she'd ever been taught was whispering in her ear, but the rain was coming down harder, the distance longer than it looked, and she got in. The recorder picked up the sound of his breath hitching when he said that, a tiny stutter in the narrative. The first crack. He described the inside of the car in too much detail, the smell of old coffee, a jacket thrown in the back seat, the radio playing softly, details that felt rehearsed until they didn't, until his voice shifted when he talked about the silence between them, the kind of silence that grows uncomfortable, the kind that makes you aware of every mile marker, every turn you take that you didn't mean to. He said he missed the turn, said it accidentally at first, said she pointed it out, said he apologized, said he turned onto a side road to correct it, and that's where the story slowed, like his mind didn't want to go there, like the road itself resisted being remembered. Detectives let the silence stretch, the clock ticking loud enough to feel like pressure, and finally, he said the words that had probably been circling him for decades. She got scared. Fear changes stories. It sharpens some edges and blurs others. He said she asked him to stop, said her voice was tight, said his hands were sweating on the wheel, said he felt accused by the fear in her eyes, like he'd already done something wrong even though, according to him, he hadn't yet. That moment, that pivot, is where truth and justification collide, where men rewrite themselves as victims of circumstance, and detectives knew it, had heard it before in different rooms, different states, different years. He said he pulled over near the tree line, said she opened the door, said he grabbed her arm, not to hurt her, he insisted, just to explain, just to calm her down, and when he said that, his voice rose defensively, the old reflex kicking in even now, even after all this time. The forest loomed in his description, dark, wet, endless, the kind of forest that swallows sound, and he said she screamed, just once, a sharp sound cut short, and he panicked. That word again, panic, the universal solvent of responsibility. He talked faster then, sentences tripping over each other, said she slipped, said she fell, said she hit her head on a rock, said everything went quiet, and the room felt smaller with every word. Detectives exchanging glances that said, we've heard the script, because accidents don't usually come packaged with this much explanation. He said he checked her pulse, said he shook her, said her eyes were open but empty, said he didn't know what to do, said he was terrified of prison, of ruining his life, of being blamed, and in that fear he made a choice that would echo for decades. He said he dragged her body deeper into the trees, the word dragged slipping out before he could soften it, said the ground was muddy, said his shoes were ruined, said branches scratched his arms, details again, vivid and ugly, and detectives felt the case changing shape, from absence to presence, from question marks to something solid and awful. He said he left her there, said he covered her with leaves, said he told himself someone would find her, that animals would take care of it, that time would erase what he'd done, and in a way, time had been his accomplice, rain and rot and growth doing what they do best. When he finished, the room went quiet, the recorder humming softly, and for a long moment no one spoke, because confession doesn't end a story, it begins a new one. They took him to the area he described, a stretch of forest that looked no different from any other, trees standing like witnesses that had never been questioned, and as he walked ahead of them his steps slowed, memory pulling him in directions he didn't consciously choose, and when he stopped, when he pointed, when he said here, the air felt heavy, like it remembered too. Forensic teams moved in, careful, methodical, eyes scanning the ground for anything that might have survived, a fragment of bone, a piece of fabric, something that could anchor his words to reality. And there, beneath decades of leaves and soil, they found it, not a body, not whole, but enough to confirm that a young woman had died there, enough to tie a name to the earth, enough to turn a missing person into a homicide at last. The news broke slowly, then all at once, whispers turning into headlines, the town holding its breath as details leaked out, the family receiving the call they had both dreaded and begged for, the call that said we found her, a sentence that carries both relief and devastation in equal measure. Her parents drove to the site, stood at the edge of the trees, the porch light at home finally turned off, and in that moment the cold case stopped being abstract, stopped being a cautionary tale, and became a wound reopened, raw and public. The man was charged, his face finally printed next to hers in the paper, 2 lives forever linked by one night of rain and fear, and as the case moved forward, as court dates were set, as lawyers prepared to argue intent and accident and responsibility, the town grappled with a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for 20 years. The monster hadn't come from the highway, he'd been living right there all along, watching the search, waiting for time to do its work. The arrest didn't bring silence, it brought noise, a low, relentless hum that spread through the town like power returning after a blackout, conversations restarting where they'd been frozen for decades, neighbors leaning across fences, radios turned up, the same name repeated until it felt unreal that it belonged to a man who had bought groceries here, paid taxes here, nodded at strangers without anyone knowing what memory he carried behind his eyes. Detectives went back to the beginning with fresh urgency, reopening boxes that smelled like dust and old coffee, photographs curling at the edges, handwritten notes from officers long retired or long dead, and suddenly those early missteps glowed under new light. The missed calls, the vague tips, the sightings that never quite lined up. A clerk remembered a nervous man buying gloves the morning after the disappearance. A mechanic recalled mud caked under a car that didn't match the weather report. A neighbor remembered hearing an engine idle too long near the tree line. memories sharpened by hindsight, guilt, and the permission to finally speak. The confession alone wasn't enough. Everyone knew that. Not in a courtroom where decades turn facts brittle, where defense attorneys thrive on gaps and erosion. So investigators began the slow work of corroboration, mapping his story against weather records, traffic logs, anything that could anchor that night in verifiable reality. Rainfall matched. The temperature drop matched. The timeline fit too neatly to ignore, and still, they pushed harder, pressing him again, watching for cracks, for places where rehearsed truth slipped into something more revealing. He added details without being asked, corrected himself mid-sentence, his voice flattening what he talked about the weeks after, how he'd driven past missing posters, how he'd attended a candlelight vigil without lighting a candle, how he'd stood in the crowd listening to prayers spoken for the very ground beneath his feet. The family's pain became a public thing, cameras lining the courthouse steps, microphones angled toward faces that had already given everything they had to give, and still they spoke, because silence had been their enemy for too long. They talked about birthdays that passed without candles, holidays that felt wrong, the way time warped around unanswered questions, each year stretching longer than the last. The mother said she'd always known, that her daughter hadn't just vanished, that people don't dissolve into air, and when she said it the room went still because belief, it turns out, is a kind of evidence too. The father said he'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, imagined confrontation, imagined rage, imagined closure, and none of it matched the dull ache he felt now. The knowledge that answers don't restore what was taken, they only change the shape of the loss. In court, the defense leaned hard into the word accident, rolling it across the floor like a shield, insisting there was no intent, no premeditation, that fear and confusion had spiraled into tragedy, and the prosecution countered with the long shadow of choice, the decision to drag, to hide, to lie, to let a family suffer for decades while life went on uninterrupted. Jurors listened to forensic experts describe soil layers like pages of a book, to psychologists explain panic and control, to detectives recount the night the case cracked open after years of silence. They saw photographs of the forest, sunlight filtering through branches that looked peaceful now, indifferent to the violence they'd absorbed, and they heard recordings of the confession, the pauses louder than the words, the breath that hitched at moments that mattered. Outside, the town wrestled with itself, with the uncomfortable realization that safety is often an illusion propped up by routine, that evil doesn't always announce itself, that sometimes it blends in so well it becomes part of the scenery. People revisited old choices, rides accepted, shortcuts taken, instincts ignored, and parents held their children tighter without quite knowing why. The case became a warning and a mirror, reflecting how quickly ordinary moments can fracture, how thin the line is between kindness and catastrophe. And still, questions lingered, because they always do, about whether there were others, about whether this was truly the only secret he carried, about what else time might be hiding in plain sight. As testimony dragged on, the man at the center of it all grew smaller, his confidence eroding under cross-examination, his certainty fraying as inconsistencies were pulled into the light. He struggled to maintain the careful balance between remorse and self-preservation, apologizing without fully owning, expressing regret without naming intent, and the jury watched closely, parsing every word, every twitch, every carefully chosen phrase. When he spoke directly to the family, his voice shook, and some believed it, some didn't, and the difference mattered less than the fact that it changed nothing. Apologies don't rewind time. They don't erase nights spent staring at ceilings, wondering if hope is a gift or a curse. The verdict, when it came, landed with a heavy finality that rippled outward, a collective exhale mixed with fresh grief, justice arriving late and imperfect, as it so often does. The sentence closed one chapter but opened another, appeals promised, paperwork piling up, the legal system grinding forward with its own indifferent momentum. For the family, there was no clean ending, only a shifting of weight, a chance to name what had been haunting them, to visit a place that now had meaning, to say goodbye to something that had never properly been laid to rest. They returned to the forest one last time, not with cameras or crowds, but with quiet, placing flowers where leaves had once hidden the truth, listening to the wind move through branches that had borne witness, without judgment. And as the story faded from headlines, as new scandals and crimes demanded attention, the case left behind a residue, a reminder etched into the town's collective memory that time doesn't heal so much as it teaches us how to live alongside scars. The road where it began looked the same, rain still falling on asphalt, cars still slowing, offers still made in moments of chance, and somewhere in that ordinariness lay the enduring unease, the knowledge that the past is never truly past, that it waits, patient and silent, for the moment someone finally dares to listen. The night kept replaying itself in fragments, not just for the family, but for the investigators now forced to inhabit it again, minute by minute, decision by decision, tracing how a single encounter metastasized into a lifetime of consequence. They reconstructed the route on maps stained with coffee rings, the stretch of highway where headlights thin out and radio signals fade, the turnout most drivers forget exists, the stand of trees dense enough to swallow sound. Each location carried a weight that hadn't been there before, as if the land itself had been waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. Patrol logs were re-examined, dispatch tapes scrubbed for background noise, the cadence of voices analyzed for what they didn't say. A call logged as routine now felt ominous. A gap between transmissions stretched into something sinister. Time, once an ally of convenience, became the enemy, exposing how much had slipped through open fingers. Witnesses came forward with stories that had curdled inside them for years, fear and doubt keeping them quiet until the confession cracked the seal. A trucker remembered a car pulled too far off the road, hazard lights blinking like a distress signal that never quite committed. A jogger recalled a scream swallowed by wind, dismissed in the moment as imagination, as wildlife, as anything but what it might have been. Their voices shook as they spoke, the relief of confession braided tightly with regret, each word an admission that silence has consequences too. Detectives listened without judgment, because blame was a luxury they couldn't afford, because every late truth still mattered, still had the power to sharpen the picture. Forensic teams returned to the site with technology that hadn't existed the first time, tools that could read stories written in soil and bone, extracting data from fragments once deemed meaningless. They spoke in precise language about trauma patterns, about force vectors and timelines, translating violence into charts and measurements that could stand up under scrutiny. The forest yielded what it had been hiding, fibers snagged on bark, trace elements that matched materials from the suspect's vehicle, a quiet vindication of instincts that had been dismissed years earlier. Each discovery tightened the net, leaving less room for denial, less space for the defense to maneuver. Inside the suspect's past, investigators found a pattern that didn't look like a pattern at first glance, just a series of near misses and questionable moments scattered across years. Traffic stops that ended with warnings, complaints that never became reports, relationships that burned hot and ended abruptly, leaving behind stories of control and volatility that had never reached a courtroom. Alone, each incident meant little. Together, they formed a silhouette that looked uncomfortably familiar, the outline of someone who had learned how to stay just inside the lines. Psychologists dissected his behavior, talking about escalation, about how opportunity and secrecy can embolden, how the absence of consequence teaches dangerous lessons. The jury absorbed it all, not as character assassination but as context, the slow assembling of motive where none had seemed obvious before. The media frenzy intensified, feeding on the collision of past and present, on the unsettling notion that monsters don't always announce themselves. Headlines screamed about cold cases and buried truths, about justice delayed but not denied, and talk shows debated morality with the confidence of people far removed from the wreckage. The family tried to tune it out, retreating into private spaces where grief could breathe without performance, but the noise found them anyway, through screens and car radios and well-meaning strangers who didn't know what to say. They learned quickly that resolution doesn't come with instructions, that knowing how something ended doesn't explain why it began. In the courtroom, tension thickened as the prosecution unveiled its narrative, weaving confession, forensics, and witness testimony into a timeline that felt inexorable. They played audio from the interrogation room, the suspect's voice wavering as he described moments he'd tried to forget, the way his words sped up when he hit something raw, the way silence fell when he reached the point of no return. The defense objected, argued coercion, suggested false memory, the fallibility of human recall after decades of internal rehearsal. Experts countered with studies, with explanations of how memory works under stress, how certain details burn themselves in too deeply to fabricate. The judge listened, weighed, ruled, the gavel a metronome marking the slow march toward judgment. Outside the legal theater, the community grappled with its own role in the story, with the uneasy awareness that crimes don't happen in a vacuum, that environments can enable as much as they obscure. Town halls filled with anxious questions about safety, about whether this case was an anomaly or a symptom, about what vigilance really means without sliding into paranoia. Law enforcement leaders spoke about reforms, about lessons learned, about the importance of taking every report seriously, even when resources are thin and outcomes uncertain. It sounded good, necessary even, but trust is a fragile thing, and rebuilding it takes more than speeches. As days blurred together, the family found themselves oscillating between exhaustion and a strange, brittle energy, fueled by the knowledge that something was finally moving. They sorted through old belongings, letters written to someone who could never read them, photographs that captured a smile frozen at an age she'd never surpass. Each item was a reminder of the life that had been interrupted, the alternate futures that had evaporated in an instant. They talked about her in the present tense sometimes, catching themselves, refusing to correct it, because language, like memory, doesn't always obey logic. The suspect's demeanor shifted as the weight of evidence pressed in, moments of defiance giving way to visible strain. He stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as testimony painted him into a corner he could no longer talk his way out of. When confronted with contradictions, he stumbled, explanations unraveling under the relentless precision of cross-examination. The mask slipped just enough to reveal flashes of anger, flashes of fear, emotions that had been tightly managed for years. Jurors took notes, their faces a study in concentration, aware that their decision would echo far beyond the room. Late one afternoon, as sunlight slanted through high windows, the prosecution rested, confidence tempered by the knowledge that nothing is certain until it's done. The defense rose, outlining its case with practiced calm, urging restraint, warning against the seductive clarity of hindsight. They spoke about reasonable doubt, about the dangers of narrative, about how time can warp both memory and motive. It was compelling in its own way, a reminder that justice demands skepticism as much as it demands empathy. The room held its breath, caught between two versions of reality, each claiming truth as its ally. And through it all, the question lingered like a low-frequency hum. What does closure actually look like when the past refuses to stay buried? The answer, it seemed, was messy and incomplete, a patchwork of relief and sorrow stitched together by necessity. As the trial moved closer to its end, as final arguments loomed, the sense of inevitability grew, not just about the verdict, but about the lasting impact of a case. Because even when the gavel falls, even when a sentence is handed down, the story doesn't dissolve. It embeds itself in memory, in cautionary tales told quietly to children, in the way people glance over their shoulders at night, in the understanding that some truths take too long to surface, and when they do, they change everything they touch. By the time closing arguments began, the room felt smaller, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen, carrying decades of tension in their silence. The prosecution spoke first, voice steady, measured, laying out the story one final time not as spectacle, but as inevitability, a chain of moments linked by choice, by opportunity, by the quiet confidence of someone who believed he would never be questioned. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't need to. They let the evidence speak, each piece placed carefully where it belonged, reminding the jury that this wasn't about perfect memory or cinematic certainty. It was about accumulation, about how truth emerges when enough fragments are allowed to align. They spoke of the night again, but differently now, stripped of mystery, anchored in fact. The road, the forest, the moment when fear tipped into violence, when a decision was made not once but over and over again, to conceal, to abandon, to erase. They reminded the jurors that time doesn't absolve, that waiting out the clock isn't the same as innocence, that justice delayed is still justice owed. When they finished, there was no dramatic pause, no flourish. Just a quiet return to their seat, the weight of the case settling into the space they left behind. The defense followed, weaving doubt like a protective barrier, urging caution, restraint, reminding the jury of the stakes not just for the family, but for the integrity of the system itself. They questioned memory, motive, the reliability of a confession made under pressure, the temptation to fill gaps with assumptions. They spoke about alternative explanations, about how easy it is to connect dots after the picture is already framed. Their words were careful, calculated, designed to slow the momentum, to reintroduce uncertainty where clarity had begun to take hold. It was persuasive in places, unsettling in others, a reminder that truth is rarely as clean as we want it to be. When the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate, the room exhaled all at once. The family gathered close, hands intertwined, eyes fixed on the door as if willing it to reopen. Outside, reporters speculated. Experts filled airtime with analysis, and the town waited, suspended between what had been and what might finally be acknowledged. Hours stretched, then more hours, time bending in that familiar way it does when everything feels at stake. No one spoke much. Words felt inadequate, fragile things that might shatter under the pressure. Behind closed doors, jurors pored over notes, revisited testimony, replayed recordings, the gravity of their task pressing down with every tick of the clock. They argued, disagreed, circled back, weighing doubt against detail, emotion against evidence. Some struggled with the age of the case, with the idea that a life could be upended so completely so long after the fact. Others fixated on the confession, on the specificity of it, on the way certain truths resist fabrication. Slowly, painfully, consensus began to form, not because every question had been answered, but because enough had. When the knock finally came, it sounded too loud, a sharp interruption to the hush that had settled over everything. The jury filed back in, faces unreadable, the verdict folded neatly in the foreperson's hands. The family stood without realizing they were standing, breath caught somewhere between hope and dread. The defendant remained seated, staring straight ahead, his reflection faintly visible in the polished wood of the table, a man confronted at last by the permanence of what he'd done. The verdict was read aloud, each word landing with a clarity that cut through the room.
Guilty.
The sound was both deafening and impossibly quiet, a single syllable carrying decades of waiting, of unanswered prayers, of nights spent imagining this exact moment and never quite believing it would come. The mother closed her eyes, tears spilling freely now, not in triumph, but in release. The father nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, as if acknowledging a truth he had carried alone for too long. The defendant's reaction was subdued, a tightening of the jaw, a brief flicker of something like disbelief, then resignation. There was no outburst, no collapse, just the slow realization that the life he'd constructed around secrecy had finally come undone. The judge spoke again, outlining next steps, sentencing to follow, the machinery of justice continuing its methodical grind. But for the family, the legal language blurred, receding into the background as the meaning of the moment settled in. Outside the courthouse, the crowd surged, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted into the open air, but the family moved through it as if underwater, sound muffled, focus narrowed to the simple act of staying upright. When they spoke, it was with care, choosing words that honored the past without being consumed by it. They thanked those who had never let the case die, who had believed when belief felt foolish, who had understood that remembering is an act of defiance. As night fell, the town began to absorb the outcome, conversations turning inward, toward reflection rather than speculation. Some felt relief. Others felt unease. The realization that the truth had been so close all along, hiding in plain sight, left a residue of discomfort that no verdict could fully erase. People locked their doors, checked on neighbors, replayed old interactions through a new lens, searching for signs they might have missed. And in the quiet that followed, after the lights dimmed and the cameras packed away, the case settled into its new shape. No longer a question mark, no longer a rumor or a cautionary tale, but a confirmed chapter in the town's history, etched permanently into its identity. The forest remained. The road remained. Life went on, as it always does. But beneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. The past had spoken, and it had been heard. Sentencing arrived without ceremony, a date circled on calendars that already felt heavy with history, and the courtroom filled again with a quieter intensity, less spectacle, more reckoning. This time there were no surprises left to unveil, no mysteries to tease apart, just the stark accounting of harm and consequence. The prosecution spoke of impact, of ripples that spread far beyond a single act, touching parents who aged under the weight of not knowing, siblings who grew up alongside absence, a community forced to carry a question mark for nearly 3 decades. They talked about deterrence, about the message sent when time fails to erase responsibility, and they spoke carefully, aware that punishment can never equal loss. The defense asked for mercy, framing the defendant as an aging man with declining health, arguing that prison would be a slow death sentence, that remorse, however late, should count for something. They pointed to letters of support, to a life that, on paper, looked unremarkable, even productive, and urged the court to see complexity rather than caricature. It was a familiar argument, one that landed differently now that the facts were no longer in dispute, now that the cost of those decades had been measured so publicly. When the family addressed the court, the room stilled in a way that no legal argument could command. The mother spoke first, voice steady despite the tremor beneath it, describing the way time fractured into before and after, how every knock at the door carried hope and dread in equal measure. She spoke of milestones missed, of conversations imagined, of the quiet anger that built when the world moved on without explanation. She did not shout. She did not curse. She simply named what had been taken and what could never be returned. The father followed, his words fewer but no less heavy, speaking about endurance, about how love persists even when answers do not, about how justice, though imperfect, mattered because it said out loud that what happened was wrong. The judge listened, eyes fixed forward, absorbing the weight of it all before delivering a sentence that echoed through the room with the force of finality. The terms were read slowly, deliberately, years stacking upon years, a lifetime reduced to numbers that would now define the remainder of the defendant's days. There was no dramatic reaction, just a subtle sag of the shoulders, the sound of breath leaving lungs as reality set in. The gavel fell, and with it, a chapter closed in the only way the system knows how. In the days that followed, the case began its slow retreat from the public eye, headlines shrinking, airtime reallocated, attention drifting elsewhere as it always does. But for those closest to it, the ending brought not peace but a recalibration, a learning curve for a new reality where the question had finally been answered. Grief changed shape. It no longer circled endlessly around uncertainty, but settled into something heavier, more defined. Some days it felt easier to carry. Other days it felt sharper, now that there was no mystery left to soften its edges. Investigators returned to their desks with a mixture of pride and exhaustion, aware that while one case had been resolved, countless others remained suspended in silence. They talked about lessons learned, about the importance of preserving evidence, of listening harder, of revisiting assumptions that calcify over time. The confession had been a catalyst, but it was persistence that had carried the case across the finish line, persistence fueled by the stubborn belief that unanswered questions are unacceptable. For younger officers, the case became a touchstone, a reminder that today's routine report might be tomorrow's defining moment. The town itself moved through a period of collective introspection, the verdict acting like a mirror held too close for comfort. People re-examined memories, conversations, moments that now felt charged with new meaning. They wondered how many other truths might be hiding in plain sight, how many silences had been mistaken for peace. Community meetings shifted from outrage to prevention, discussions about lighting, patrols, education, about creating systems that make it harder for harm to disappear unnoticed. It was imperfect, uneven work, but it mattered because doing nothing had proven too costly. For the family, rituals took on new significance. They visited the place where the forest opened into quiet, not to search anymore, but to acknowledge. They brought photographs, letters, objects that had waited years for a destination, and they spoke aloud words that had once felt futile. There was sadness, yes, but also a strange clarity, a sense that memory could finally rest on solid ground. They planned a memorial, not as a reopening of wounds, but as a statement that her life had weight, that it deserved to be remembered for more than the way it ended. And yet, even as resolution settled in, it never fully erased the unease that had threaded through the story from the beginning. The knowledge that a confession had been necessary, that truth had waited decades for the right moment to surface, lingered like a warning. It suggested that justice is not automatic, that it depends on chance, on courage, on the fragile intersection of opportunity and conscience. It reminded everyone that while some stories do reach an ending, many do not, and that the distance between those outcomes is often uncomfortably thin. As seasons changed and life resumed its familiar rhythms, the case remained, not as an open wound but as a scar, visible when the light hit it just right. It lived in conversations lowered to a hush, in the way parents paused before answering questions about safety, in the collective understanding that vigilance is not paranoia but memory put to use. The mystery had been unraveled, the confession spoken, the verdict delivered, and still, the echo persisted, a quiet reminder that the past does not fade on its own. It waits, and sometimes, when least expected, it speaks. Years later, when the case had been archived under the quiet label of resolved, its presence still pulsed beneath the surface of ordinary days, surfacing in unexpected ways, in questions asked too late at night, in the reflexive tightening of the chest when a siren cut through the dark. Resolution, it turned out, was not a door that closed cleanly, but a corridor that narrowed slowly, forcing everyone who had been touched by the story to walk it at their own pace. The family discovered this first, learning that certainty does not cancel grief, it clarifies it, stripping away the haze of possibility and leaving behind the sharp outline of what was lost. They tried to build new routines around the absence that had once defined them, small acts of reclamation that felt radical in their simplicity. Sunday dinners without the undercurrent of speculation. Holidays marked by remembrance instead of unanswered questions. They spoke her name more freely now, no longer afraid that doing so would invite false hope or reopen wounds that had never fully healed. Yet even in these moments of progress, there were setbacks, days when anger surged unexpectedly, not just at the man who had taken her life, but at the time stolen, at the years consumed by not knowing, at a system that had needed a confession to finally listen. The investigators, too, carried the case forward in quieter ways, each of them changed by the experience, whether they admitted it or not. For some, it became a cautionary tale shared with rookies, a reminder that complacency is the enemy of justice, that the details dismissed today may be the ones that matter most tomorrow. For others, it was more personal, a lingering sense of responsibility that extended beyond this single outcome, fueling a renewed determination to revisit other cold cases, to question old assumptions, to treat silence not as absence, but as potential evidence waiting for the right moment. Within the department, policies shifted subtly but meaningfully. Evidence rooms reorganized, protocols updated, training sessions infused with the hard-earned lessons of the past. There was no grand announcement, no sweeping reform attributed to one case, just a gradual recalibration born of discomfort, of the realization that the margin for error had once been too wide. It was an acknowledgement that justice, like memory, requires maintenance, attention, and the willingness to confront failure without defensiveness. The community's relationship with the story evolved as well, the initial shock of the confession giving way to a more complex reckoning. Some residents felt vindicated, relieved that their unease had not been misplaced. Others grappled with guilt, replaying moments when they might have spoken up, might have asked harder questions, might have refused to accept the convenient explanations offered at the time. Conversations grew more honest, less performative, touching on the uncomfortable truth that safety is often assumed rather than ensured, that trust, once broken, demands active repair. In schools and community centers, discussions about awareness and accountability took on new urgency, framed not as fear-mongering but as empowerment, an effort to transform a painful legacy into something preventative. The story was no longer just a cautionary headline but a reference point, a reminder of what happens when warning signs are ignored, when discomfort is smoothed over in the name of normalcy. It wasn't about reliving the horror, it was about refusing to let it fade into abstraction. And still, there were nights when the past pressed in, when dreams replayed scenes no one could ever fully witness, when the confession echoed in the mind like a recording that couldn't be turned off. The family learned to sit with that discomfort, to recognize it as part of the cost of knowing, a cost they had once begged to pay. They sought counseling, leaned on one another, discovered that healing is less about forgetting and more about integrating the truth into a life that continues, whether it feels ready or not. The man responsible faded into the background of the narrative, his name mentioned less frequently as the focus shifted back where it belonged. He became a fact rather than a fixation, a reminder that while perpetrators can be identified and punished, they do not get to define the meaning of the story. That power, reclaimed slowly and deliberately, belonged to those who had endured, to the memory of the life interrupted, to the community that had been forced to grow up around a question mark. As time stretched on, anniversaries passed differently than before, marked not by renewed pleas for information but by quiet reflection, by gatherings that felt less like vigils and more like affirmations. Candles still flickered, photographs still circulated, but the tone had changed. There was sadness, yes, but also a measure of steadiness, a sense that the ground beneath their feet, once so unstable, had finally begun to hold. Yet the case never truly receded into history. It lingered in the margins, in the way detectives paused before closing files, in the way families of the missing watched the news with a mix of hope and dread, wondering if their story might one day follow a similar arc. It existed as proof that truth can surface after decades of silence, and as a warning that it often does so unevenly, dependent on variables no one can fully control. In that tension, between hope and caution, the legacy of the case took root. Not as a neat conclusion, but as a living reminder that justice is fragile, that memory is an active force, and that the line between forgotten and found is thinner than anyone wants to believe. The confession had unraveled the mystery, yes, but it had also exposed something deeper, a collective responsibility to listen harder, to wait less, to understand that silence is rarely empty. It is filled with things we have not yet learned how to hear. Time continued its quiet advance, indifferent to resolution, and with it came the long aftermath no verdict could script. The case slipped further from headlines into footnotes, but for those who had lived inside it, the story kept breathing, reshaping itself with each passing year. The family learned that closure was not a finish line, but a recalibration, a constant adjustment to a world where certainty existed alongside loss. They discovered new questions rising where old ones had finally been laid to rest, questions about identity, about who they had become while waiting, about how much of their lives had been shaped by an absence that no longer needed to be imagined. They sorted through boxes that had gone untouched for decades, artifacts of a suspended time. Letters written but never sent. Clothing carefully folded, preserved against hope. Photographs that now carried a different gravity, no longer placeholders for reunion, but proof of a life that had fully existed. Each object demanded attention, asked to be acknowledged not as evidence or memory alone, but as part of a narrative that had finally found its spine. There were tears, arguments, moments of unexpected laughter, the messy human work of integrating truth into memory. In the investigative world, the case gained a second life as a teaching tool, dissected not for spectacle, but for insight. Detectives spoke openly about missteps, about how assumptions hardened into blind spots, about how the absence of technology had once narrowed possibilities that now felt obvious in hindsight. They talked about the confession, not as a miracle, but as a reminder that answers can arrive from unexpected directions, that persistence sometimes means simply staying receptive, leaving a door open long enough for someone to finally walk through it. Cold case units across the region quietly revisited their own backlogs, inspired not by optimism alone, but by a sharpened sense of accountability. They pulled files that had gathered dust, re-examined evidence with modern eyes, reached out to witnesses long dismissed as unreliable or irrelevant. Most cases did not yield breakthroughs. Many remained stubbornly silent. But the effort itself carried meaning, a collective refusal to let time dictate worthiness. The Oregon case had proven that patience and pressure could coexist, that waiting did not have to mean surrender. The community's relationship with law enforcement evolved as well, marked by a cautious rebuilding of trust. Town halls grew more candid, residents more willing to voice concerns, officers more transparent about limitations and lessons learned. It wasn't perfect. There were setbacks, moments when old suspicions resurfaced, when progress felt fragile. But there was also a shared understanding that silence had once cost too much, that communication, however uncomfortable, was a necessary risk. For the family, public attention became something to manage rather than endure. They learned to set boundaries, to decide which questions deserved answers and which could be left untouched. They spoke at events, not to relive trauma but to honor persistence, to remind others that demanding answers is not an act of aggression but of love. Their voices carried a weight that no official statement ever could, grounded in lived experience, tempered by years of waiting. And still, in quiet moments, the confession echoed, not as a revelation anymore but as a marker in time, dividing life into before and after. The knowledge it brought was both anchor and burden, grounding the story in fact while reopening emotional terrain that uncertainty had once kept at bay. They learned to sit with that duality, to accept that peace and pain are not opposites but companions, moving together through the long arc of healing. The man at the center of the confession receded further into abstraction, his presence reduced to a name on legal documents, a figure in institutional clothing. He no longer occupied the family's imagination the way he once had. That space had been reclaimed by memories of her, by stories shared and reshaped, by a deliberate effort to let her life, not her death, define what endured. It was a quiet reclamation, but a powerful one. As years layered themselves onto the story, the case took on a different kind of significance, less about shock and more about endurance. It became a reference point for those navigating their own unanswered questions, a reminder that truth can surface even after long dormancy, but also a caution that waiting carries costs no one fully anticipates. It was no longer a symbol of mystery alone, but of the complicated aftermath that follows revelation. In the end, what lingered most was not the drama of the confession or the weight of the sentence, but the subtle, persistent transformation that followed. The way conversations changed, the way memories settled, the way a community learned, imperfectly, to listen more closely to the quiet spaces where answers often hide. The mystery had been unraveled, yes, but what remained was something deeper, a collective awareness that truth, once uncovered, does not simply conclude a story. It reshapes everyone who stands within its reach. The years that followed settled into a strange equilibrium, a balance between remembrance and movement that no one had been taught how to achieve. Life insisted on continuing, and yet the shadow of the case lingered, not as a threat but as a presence, an undercurrent shaping decisions in subtle ways. The family learned that even with answers, there would always be moments when the past rose uninvited, triggered by a sound, a smell, a passing face in a crowd. These intrusions were no longer questions, but echoes, reminders that resolution does not erase impact, it merely changes its form. They began to speak openly about the long wait, about what it means to live inside uncertainty for decades and then step out of it into a world that expects relief to look like happiness. Friends and acquaintances, unsure how to respond, often defaulted to congratulations, as if the truth were a prize finally claimed. The family learned to accept the gesture while quietly redefining it. This was not a victory. It was an ending, hard-earned and incomplete, carrying both gravity and relief in equal measure. In private moments, they revisited old conversations, reinterpreted memories through the lens of what was now known. Statements once dismissed as harmless took on sharper edges. Gaps in timelines grew clearer, no longer obscured by speculation. There was pain in this clarity, but also a strange validation. The instincts they had doubted for years, the discomfort they had been told to ignore, had not been imagined. The truth had been there, waiting, just beyond reach. The investigators who remained connected to the case found themselves reflecting more often on the concept of time, on how easily it becomes both ally and adversary. They spoke about burnout, about the emotional toll of carrying unresolved stories, about the quiet fear that comes with realizing how many cases will never benefit from a confession or a technological leap. The Oregon case had been resolved, yes, but it had also sharpened their awareness of fragility, of how dependent justice can be on circumstance rather than certainty. Some of them reached out to other families still waiting, careful not to offer false hope, but unwilling to retreat into professional distance. They understood now, perhaps more than before, that acknowledgement itself has value, that being seen and heard can sustain people even when answers remain elusive. It was a small shift, but a meaningful one, born from the understanding that silence, when prolonged, becomes its own form of harm. In the broader cultural conversation, the case joined a growing archive of stories that challenged the assumption that time heals all wounds. Commentators pointed to it as evidence that unresolved trauma does not fade. It adapts, embedding itself into families and communities, shaping behavior across generations. The narrative shifted away from sensationalism toward reflection, toward questions about how systems respond to disappearance, how society measures urgency, whose stories are prioritized, and whose are allowed to drift into obscurity. The family watched this discourse from a distance, selective about engagement, protective of what little peace they had carved out. They understood the importance of awareness, but they also understood the cost of becoming a symbol. They chose instead to focus on legacy, on ensuring that her name was associated not just with a case file, but with a life remembered accurately and fully. They funded scholarships, supported local initiatives, created spaces where her story could inspire care rather than fear. There were moments of unexpected grace. Strangers wrote letters, not asking questions, but offering gratitude, sharing how the story had prompted them to reconnect with estranged loved ones, to speak up about their own concerns, to trust their instincts more deeply. These messages did not undo the past, but they reframed its reach, suggesting that even the darkest chapters can cast light in directions no one anticipates. And still, beneath all of it, there remained a quiet unease, a recognition that this outcome, however meaningful, was not guaranteed. The confession had come not because the system demanded it at the right moment, but because an individual chose to speak after years of silence. That randomness lingered, a reminder that truth often depends on fragile human variables. It was a humbling realization, one that tempered any temptation toward closure as a clean, satisfying concept. As another decade approached, the case marked time in ways calendars could not. Anniversaries passed with less fanfare, more introspection. The family no longer counted years of not knowing, but years of knowing, measuring progress not by distance from the event, but by depth of understanding. They had learned that healing is not linear, that it loops and pauses, accelerates and stalls, guided more by internal shifts than external milestones. In quiet moments, when the world felt momentarily still, the story settled into something resembling peace, not because the pain was gone, but because it had been named, acknowledged, and woven into a larger narrative of endurance. The mystery that once dominated everything had been dismantled, piece by piece, replaced by a truth that, while painful, allowed life to move forward with intention rather than inertia. The case no longer asked questions. It offered lessons about listening, about patience, about the cost of waiting and the courage it takes to speak, even when speaking comes too late to change the outcome. And in that offering, it continued to live, not as an open wound, but as a reminder that some stories, once finally told, do not end. They evolve, carrying forward the weight of what was lost and the quiet insistence that it mattered. The truth, once spoken aloud, had altered the shape of time itself. What once felt like a long, unbroken night now revealed seams and fractures, moments where things might have gone differently, where a question asked or an instinct followed could have bent the story onto another path. This awareness settled heavily on everyone involved, not as regret alone, but as a heightened sensitivity to the present. The past could no longer be changed, but it had sharpened the edges of now. For the family, this meant learning how to exist without the vigilance that had once been second nature. They were no longer scanning crowds or dissecting headlines for familiar patterns. The constant readiness for news, good or bad, had finally loosened its grip. In its place came a quieter, more disorienting challenge, deciding who they were without the search. For decades, their identity had been entwined with the case, with advocacy, with waiting. Letting go of that role felt both liberating and frightening, like stepping off a moving platform into stillness. They spoke openly about this disorientation, about the strange guilt that accompanied moments of happiness, about the fear that moving forward might be mistaken for forgetting. Counselors reminded them that memory does not require suffering to remain intact, that honoring the past does not demand perpetual pain. These ideas took time to settle, resisted at first, then slowly absorbed as experience proved them true. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then more freely, no longer followed by immediate remorse. Within law enforcement, the case continued to reverberate, reshaping conversations about accountability and humility. Veterans spoke candidly with younger officers about the danger of certainty, about how easy it is to mistake familiarity for understanding. They emphasized that unresolved cases are not failures frozen in time, but responsibilities that age alongside the people affected by them. This shift did not erase past mistakes, but it acknowledged them in a way that felt overdue. Training sessions began to include narratives like this one, not as triumphs, but as warnings. They highlighted the importance of documentation, of preserving even the most unremarkable details, of resisting the urge to close doors simply because they have been open too long. The confession had exposed not just an individual's guilt, but a system's vulnerability to complacency. That lesson lingered, uncomfortable but necessary. The broader community continued to process the story in waves, some people still grappling with disbelief, others quietly reassessing their own memories of the time. Old rumors resurfaced, not with the power to rewrite history, but with the clarity to be understood for what they were. Conversations once avoided now felt possible, even essential. There was a collective reckoning underway, not dramatic or loud, but persistent, driven by the understanding that silence had once been mistaken for peace. For the family, public curiosity gradually softened into respect. Requests for interviews slowed. The story no longer belonged to the news cycle. It belonged to them. They chose carefully when to speak and when to remain private, guided by a sense of ownership that had been denied to them for so long. When they did share, it was with intention, focusing less on the crime and more on the human cost of waiting, on the resilience required to live in uncertainty and still hope. They found unexpected strength in connecting with others whose stories remained unresolved. These conversations were not about guarantees or timelines, but about endurance, about surviving the long stretches of not knowing without losing oneself entirely. They offered what they could: honesty, empathy, the acknowledgement that answers, when they come, may not arrive in the form imagined, but they still matter. As the years passed, the confession lost its shock value, settling into the historical record as a fact rather than a revelation. What remained potent was its aftermath, the way it had exposed layers of grief and responsibility that no single moment could resolve. The case had been reopened, unraveled, and closed again, but its influence persisted, shaping how people approached uncertainty, how they responded to unanswered questions in their own lives. In quieter moments, the family reflected on how much of their endurance had been built in darkness, guided by instinct rather than information. They recognized the cost of that endurance, the toll it had taken on relationships, on health, on trust. And yet, they also recognized its value, the way it had kept memory alive when forgetting would have been easier. This duality became part of their story, not a contradiction, but a testament to complexity. The mystery that once defined everything had been stripped away, revealing a truth that was neither neat nor redemptive, but real. And in that reality, there was room for growth, for mourning, for a future no longer held hostage by unanswered questions. The confession had closed a door, but beyond it lay a landscape still being mapped, one step at a time, guided not by urgency, but by intention. The case no longer demanded attention. It invited reflection. And in that reflection, it continued to shape lives, quietly, persistently, reminding everyone who encountered it that truth, when it finally surfaces, does not end a story. It changes how every chapter that follows is written. By the time the case reached what officials called resolution, the word itself had lost its simplicity. Resolution suggested a straight line, a clean break, but nothing about this journey had ever been clean. The truth had arrived late, distorted by time, filtered through memory and motive, and it carried with it consequences that did not fit neatly into legal definitions. What followed was not relief, but reckoning. The confession forced institutions to look inward. Files were reopened not to find new suspects, but to trace old decisions. Why certain leads were deprioritized. Why some voices were dismissed while others were amplified. Meetings were held behind closed doors, not for optics, but for survival, because the case had become a mirror and what it reflected was uncomfortable.
Procedures were revised.
Language changed. Words like unlikely and unsubstantiated were reconsidered, recognized for how easily they could become excuses. For the detectives who had worked the case in its earliest days, the confession landed like a delayed impact. Some were retired now, their careers already summarized in plaques and farewell speeches. Others were gone entirely, their answers permanently out of reach. Those still alive grappled with a mix of vindication and regret. Vindication that the case had not been imagined, that the unanswered questions had been real. Regret that the answers had come too late to change outcomes, too late to correct trajectories already set. The family watched this process with a careful distance. They had learned, through years of waiting, that proximity to the system did not guarantee protection. They listened when invited, spoke when asked, but no longer chased validation from official channels. The confession had given them something more durable than acknowledgement. It had given them certainty, and certainty, once achieved, proved strangely resistant to erosion. In private, the emotional landscape continued to shift. Anger surfaced in unexpected ways, not explosive, but precise, directed at moments long past, at decisions that now felt avoidable. There were days when grief felt sharper than it ever had during the years of uncertainty, sharpened by the clarity of what had been taken. There were also days of calm, grounded by the knowledge that the story no longer required imagination to complete it. The person who had confessed became a study in absence. Their explanation, parsed and reparsed, offered facts but little meaning. Motive remained thin, insufficient to account for the magnitude of harm. Psychologists weighed in, analysts debated, but the family understood something those discussions often missed. Explanation does not equal understanding. Knowing what happened does not automatically explain why it mattered so deeply, or why it echoed for so long. In the community, memory reorganized itself. People revised their internal timelines, adjusted assumptions, reclassified rumors as warnings missed. The story shifted from legend to lesson. Parents spoke differently to their children. Neighbors paid closer attention. The idea that something so devastating could hide in plain sight for decades unsettled long-held beliefs about safety and familiarity. Media attention returned briefly, then receded again, leaving behind a quieter, more reflective discourse. This was no longer a spectacle. It was a case study in endurance, in the cost of silence, in the fragile mechanics of truth. The family declined most requests, choosing instead to protect the fragile equilibrium they had built. They understood now that peace was not something granted by outcomes, but something actively maintained. As time moved forward, the case found its place in institutional memory, cited in policy discussions, referenced in training manuals, remembered as a turning point not because it was solved, but because of how long it wasn't. It became shorthand for what happens when persistence collides with time, when answers arrive long after the questions have reshaped lives. And still, in the quiet spaces between conversations and obligations, the weight of it all remained. Not heavy enough to crush, but present enough to be felt. A reminder that truth does not restore what was lost. It redefines what remains. The mystery had been unraveled, yes, but the story was no longer about the mystery. It was about aftermath. About learning to live in a world where the unknown had finally spoken, and what it said could never be unheard. There was a moment, sometime after the legal language had settled and the last procedural steps were completed, when the world seemed to exhale. Not in celebration, not in relief, but in recognition. The case had crossed a threshold. It was no longer suspended between questions. It had weight now, gravity pulling it firmly into the past, even as its influence continued to ripple outward. For the family, this shift was felt most strongly in the smallest routines. Simple decisions, once fraught with invisible calculations, began to feel lighter. They noticed it when making plans without contingency, when committing to future dates without hesitation, when allowing themselves to imagine years ahead rather than merely enduring the present. These were quiet changes, almost imperceptible, but together they marked a transformation that decades of uncertainty had delayed. They began sorting through belongings that had remained untouched for years, preserved not out of sentimentality alone, but because opening those boxes had once felt like reopening the wound itself. Now, with the truth established, the objects took on a different quality. They were no longer artifacts of a mystery. They were remnants of a life. Photographs were studied not for clues, but for expressions, gestures, moments of ordinary joy. Letters were read without searching between the lines. The past, once interrogated, was finally allowed to simply exist. This process brought both comfort and sorrow. There was grief in recognizing how much time had been lost to waiting, how many milestones had passed under the shadow of not knowing. There was also gratitude, unexpected and complex, for the resilience that waiting had forged. The family had survived something that reshaped them fundamentally, and while they would never claim it made them stronger in a celebratory sense, it had made them deeply attuned to one another, bound by an understanding few others could share. Within the investigative community, the case continued to prompt reflection long after its official closure. Younger detectives studied it with a mixture of fascination and caution, aware that they were inheriting both its lessons and its limitations. Veterans spoke about it less often, but when they did, their tone carried a subdued intensity. This was not a story of triumph. It was a reminder of how fragile certainty can be, how easily momentum can stall, how much depends on persistence sustained over years that offer little encouragement. The confession itself remained a point of quiet debate, not because its validity was questioned, but because of its timing. Why now? Why after so long? Analysts proposed theories rooted in psychology, in aging, in conscience, in fear. None of them fully satisfied. The truth, it seemed, was less elegant than any explanation. Sometimes people speak not because conditions are perfect, but because silence becomes heavier than exposure. That realization unsettled those who had built careers on predictability. In the community, the case's resolution altered the collective memory of the era in which it occurred. What had once been remembered as a time of relative calm was now understood as something more complicated. Stories resurfaced, not all of them directly connected, but linked by a shared awareness that danger does not always announce itself. Conversations shifted from nostalgia to scrutiny, from assumption to awareness. It was an uncomfortable but necessary recalibration. The family observed these changes from a careful distance. They had learned the cost of proximity, of allowing their pain to be consumed by public curiosity. Now they chose boundaries deliberately. When they spoke, it was to advocate for patience, for evidence preservation, for listening when concerns are raised, even when they disrupt convenient narratives. They spoke not as symbols, but as people who had lived through the consequences of being unheard. Privately, they continued to navigate the emotional terrain left behind by the case. There were days when the finality felt grounding, when certainty provided a stable platform from which to grieve. There were other days when anger surged unexpectedly, directed not only at the individual responsible, but at the years themselves, at the relentless passage of time that had taken so much without pause. These emotions coexisted, no longer in conflict, but in dialogue, each informing the other. The absence at the center of the story remained. No resolution could change that, but its shape had changed. It was no longer an open question, a void demanding answers. It was a known loss, defined and acknowledged. This distinction mattered more than anyone outside the experience could easily understand. To know what happened did not lessen the pain, but it allowed the pain to be placed somewhere, rather than carried everywhere. As months passed, the case receded further into the background of daily life. Not forgotten, never that, but integrated. It no longer dictated the rhythm of existence. It became one thread among many, significant but not singular. The family began to recognize moments of genuine peace, not because the past had been resolved, but because it no longer dominated every thought. In this new equilibrium, the story continued to teach. It taught patience without romanticizing endurance. It taught vigilance without paranoia. It taught that truth, when delayed, still matters, and that the act of uncovering it, however late, carries its own form of justice. Not the justice of restoration, but the justice of recognition. The mystery that had once defined everything was gone. In its place stood a truth that demanded responsibility, reflection, and care. And in living with that truth, the family, the community, and those who had carried the case learned something enduring, that even after decades of silence, the past can still speak, and when it does, it reshapes the future in ways both subtle and profound. Time did what it always does after the noise fades. It stretched. It thinned the sharp edges of public attention and replaced them with long, quiet days where the meaning of everything had to be renegotiated. The case, once a constant presence, no longer dictated the rhythm of mornings or the weight of nights. And yet it never fully disappeared. It lived in pauses, in glances exchanged without words, in moments when the mind drifted backward without warning. For the family, the future no longer felt like a threat, but it did feel unfamiliar. For years, forward motion had been postponed, delayed by the expectation that answers were still coming. Now that they had arrived, the space ahead felt wide, almost too open. Plans were made slowly. Decisions were measured not by fear, but by a careful awareness of how fragile certainty can be. They had learned, the hard way, that life can fracture without notice, and that knowledge never truly leaves you. They began to mark time differently, not by anniversaries of disappearance or discovery, but by personal milestones reclaimed from the shadow of the case. Birthdays regained their meaning. Holidays felt less heavy. There were moments when joy arrived unannounced, surprising in its ease, followed by brief flashes of disbelief, as if happiness itself needed permission now. Over time, those moments grew longer, more frequent, until they no longer felt like exceptions. The truth had altered relationships in subtle ways. Some bonds deepened, forged through shared endurance. Others quietly faded, unable to survive the long years of tension and unresolved grief. The family accepted this without bitterness. They understood that prolonged trauma reveals fault lines that were always present, testing patience, loyalty, and emotional capacity. What remained was smaller, but stronger, rooted in mutual understanding rather than obligation. In professional circles, the case continued to echo as a cautionary tale. Conferences referenced it not for its dramatic resolution, but for its timeline, for the years lost between evidence collected and evidence understood. Experts spoke about technological limits, about missed opportunities, about the ethical responsibility to revisit what has been set aside. The story became less about what went wrong in one investigation and more about what can go wrong in any system that assumes time will erase relevance. There was a growing recognition that cold cases are not static. They age alongside the people they affect. Witnesses forget or pass away. Evidence degrades. Context shifts. And yet, the Oregon case proved that even in this erosion, fragments can survive, waiting for the right moment, the right question, the right willingness to look again. That realization carried both hope and unease. The individual who had confessed receded from focus, becoming a fixed point rather than an active presence. Their words remained, recorded and analyzed, but the family chose not to dwell on them. The confession had served its purpose. It had filled the silence. Beyond that, it offered nothing that could restore what was taken. Obsession with motive or remorse felt hollow. What mattered was not their internal reckoning, but the external truth now established. In moments of reflection, the family spoke about forgiveness, but not in absolutes. They rejected the idea that forgiveness was required for healing or that it followed a predictable path. For them, healing came from acknowledgement, from no longer having to justify their pain or their persistence. If forgiveness ever arrived, it would do so quietly, on its own terms, without performance or expectation. The community continued to adjust, carrying the case forward in altered form. It became part of local history, taught not as folklore, but as fact. New residents learned of it not through whispers, but through documented memory. The story lost its mystique, replaced by something more sobering and more useful: understanding. Understanding that ordinary places can hold extraordinary darkness. Understanding that attention, when withheld, has consequences. As the years progressed, the family found themselves increasingly focused on the present. The past no longer demanded constant vigilance. It remained important, honored, but it did not consume. They learned that remembrance and living are not opposing forces, that it is possible to carry loss without allowing it to define every step forward. This balance was not achieved all at once. It was practiced imperfectly every day. The case had once been a question mark suspended over everything. Now, it was a statement, a truth, heavy and undeniable, but finite. And in that finitude, there was space to breathe. The mystery had unraveled, but what remained was not emptiness. It was a quieter landscape shaped by endurance, by lessons learned too late, but not without impact. The story no longer screamed. It whispered. And those who listened carefully understood that its power lay not in its shock, but in its persistence, in the way it continued to shape lives long after the headlines faded, reminding everyone that answers, when they finally come, change more than the past. They change how the future is lived. By the time the story reached its later years, the urgency that once defined every conversation had transformed into something quieter, heavier, more deliberate. The case no longer erupted into daily thought like an open wound. Instead, it settled into the background like a deep ache, noticeable not because it demanded attention, but because it had become part of the body itself. Everyone touched by it learned to move with that weight, adjusting posture, pace, expectation. For the family, this stage was marked by a strange clarity. The truth had removed uncertainty, but it had also stripped away illusion. There was no longer room to imagine alternative endings, no comforting fantasy in which a different choice or a missed detail might have changed everything. The narrative was fixed now, unyielding. And yet, in that finality, there was a sense of grounding. They were no longer suspended between hope and fear. They were standing on solid ground, even if that ground was cold. They spoke less often about the crime itself and more about its impact, about how waiting had altered their sense of time, how years of unanswered questions had trained them to listen for bad news, to distrust quiet, to interpret normal delays as ominous signs. Unlearning those instincts took effort. Peace did not arrive automatically with answers. It had to be rebuilt, deliberately, through repetition, reassurance, and patience with themselves. Certain places still carried a charge. Streets, buildings, familiar routes that had once been backdrops to ordinary life now felt marked, permanently altered by association. The family did not avoid them, but they approached them with awareness, sometimes choosing to confront the memory head-on, sometimes choosing distance. Both choices were valid. Healing, they learned, is not linear, and it does not demand consistency to be real. Within the justice system, the case continued to serve as a reference point, not loudly but persistently. It appeared in footnotes of policy reviews, in quiet conversations between colleagues, in moments when someone hesitated before dismissing a lead. Its influence was subtle but enduring. It reminded professionals that closure is not a switch to be flipped, that behind every file number is a network of lives absorbing the consequences of delay. There were discussions about responsibility, about whether accountability could or should extend beyond the individual who confessed. These conversations were careful, measured, often unresolved. Blame, once introduced, tends to spread outward, touching systems, cultures, assumptions. Some resisted this, preferring to isolate fault. Others argued that isolation was precisely what had allowed the case to remain dormant for so long. The tension between these views never fully resolved, but it did encourage scrutiny where there had once been complacency. The community's relationship with the story continued to evolve. It was no longer something spoken about in hushed tones or dramatic retellings. It became quieter, more reflective. Teachers referenced it when discussing civic responsibility. Local journalists treated it with restraint rather than sensationalism. The case matured, losing its shock value but gaining depth, understood now as a long arc rather than a single moment of violence. For the family, one of the most profound changes was internal. The vigilance that had once defined their days slowly loosened. They stopped bracing for impact. They allowed themselves to trust moments of calm without immediately questioning their legitimacy. This shift did not erase grief. It reframed it. Grief became something they carried consciously rather than something that ambushed them without warning. They found meaning in small rituals, acts of remembrance that did not demand public recognition. Lighting a candle on an ordinary evening, returning to a place that held significance, not to relive the pain, but to acknowledge survival. These gestures were not about closure. They were about continuity, about honoring what had been lost while affirming what remained. As time moved forward, the case ceased to define their identity in the eyes of others. New acquaintances did not know the story. Some longtime friends no longer mentioned it. This anonymity was both strange and welcome. It allowed the family to exist without explanation, to be present without context. For the first time in decades, their lives were not immediately tethered to a tragedy. And yet, the story was never truly gone. It lived in memory, in the quiet confidence that comes from having endured something profound and survived. It lived in the way they responded to uncertainty, with patience rather than panic. It lived in their empathy for others navigating unresolved loss. The case had reshaped them, not visibly but fundamentally. As the years accumulated, the urgency faded, but the significance did not. The cold case had been reopened, unraveled, and laid to rest, but its legacy persisted in quieter forms, in changed procedures, in softened assumptions, in people who learned, too late perhaps, but not without consequence, that truth delayed is not truth denied, but it carries a cost that echoes long after it arrives. What remained was not resolution in the cinematic sense. There were no sweeping gestures, no final sense of triumph. There was only a gradual settling, a recalibration of life after certainty. And in that settling, there was a fragile, hard-won peace, not because the past had been repaired, but because it had finally been faced, fully and without illusion. In the end, what remained was not the echo of sirens or the sharp punctuation of headlines, but a quieter understanding that settled slowly, almost imperceptibly, into everyday life. The case no longer announced itself. It did not demand attention. It existed as a fixed point in the past, acknowledged, integrated, no longer chasing those who had once been trapped inside it. The mystery that had consumed years had finally released its grip, not with force, but with resignation. For the family, this final phase was not about moving on, a phrase that never fit comfortably, but about moving forward with awareness. They understood now that survival after truth is its own discipline. It requires patience. It requires permission to live without constantly looking back over one's shoulder. It requires accepting that some questions, even when answered, leave impressions that never fully fade. They learn to carry those impressions without letting them dictate every choice. The absence that had defined so much of their existence was still there, but it no longer dominated the landscape. It had a place. It had boundaries. It no longer bled into every moment uninvited. This shift was subtle, cumulative, built from thousands of ordinary days lived without the constant pressure of the unknown. Each day added a layer of distance, not from memory, but from captivity. They spoke, occasionally, about what the case had taught them, but not in slogans or sound bites. They spoke about listening when something feels wrong, about resisting the urge to simplify pain, about the danger of assuming time will solve what only attention can address. These conversations were not performances. They were offerings shaped by experience rather than theory. The justice system moved on, as it always does, absorbing the case into its archives, its statistics, its lessons learned and sometimes forgotten. New cases took precedence. New urgencies emerged. And yet, for those who had been closest to it, this story remained a reference point, a reminder that every unresolved file represents lives paused, altered, reshaped by uncertainty. It reinforced a truth that could never be fully institutionalized, that behind every delay is a human cost. The community continued its quiet recalibration. The story became part of its collective memory, not as an open wound, but as a scar, visible if you know where to look. Evidence of something endured. Evidence of vulnerability survived. It influenced how people spoke about safety, about trust, about the thin line between normalcy and rupture. It encouraged attentiveness, not fear. Awareness, not suspicion. And slowly, almost without noticing, life expanded again. The future regained dimension. Plans extended further ahead. The present became more than a holding pattern. This did not happen because the past had been resolved, but because it had been acknowledged, named, and given its rightful place. The truth had done what it could. The rest belonged to time. The case that once refused to end had finally settled into silence. Not the silence of secrecy or denial, but the silence that follows understanding. The kind that allows space for breathing, for remembering without reliving, for honoring without remaining trapped. There was no final image, no closing line that could encapsulate what had been lost or what had been learned. There was only continuation. Life, imperfect and ongoing, shaped but not defined by what had come before. The mystery had ended, but the story did not. It simply changed tone, moving away from suspense and into something quieter, steadier, more human. And in that quiet, the most enduring truth revealed itself. Not that every cold case will be solved. Not that justice always arrives on time. But that truth, when it finally emerges, even decades late, has the power to release the living from the weight of waiting. To return time its forward motion. To remind those left behind that while the past cannot be rewritten, the future, once freed from uncertainty, can finally begin.